Welcome back, everybody. This time we're taking a close look at Howard Lutnick, the U.S. Secretary of Commerce.
Welcome to Logistics Pulse, sponsored by Mothership. Skip the broker to save big on LTL shipments, or deliver same day nationwide. For more insights like these, don't forget to subscribe to Logistics Pulse on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
We've got stuff about Lutnick's background, his career, and then some of his early policy decisions and how those are playing out in different industries. Should be interesting.
It really should. And, one thing that jumped out at me right away was, Lutnick's personal story. I mean, losing both parents as a teenager and then going on to lead a firm like Cantor Fitzgerald. It's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, it's definitely a story of resilience. And now he's shaping U.S. trade policy. It makes you wonder how those early experiences have influenced his worldview,
Oh, for sure. I was thinking, could this drive to bolster American industries come from a deep-seated need for security, maybe something that goes all the way back to those early losses?
Yep. Yeah, that's a really interesting thought. And the sources kind of hint at that, too. Remember, Haverford College gave him a full scholarship after his parents passed away. It seems like even then people recognized his potential, his drive.
Right. And now that same tenacity is fueling his America First economic stance.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so let's break down this America First approach. Doesn't that risk isolating the U.S. economically? After all, global trade has been the norm for decades now.
That's the big debate, isn't it? At its core, protectionism tries to protect domestic industries from foreign competition. And that's exactly what Lutnick's doing with these tariffs, especially for sectors he sees as crucial for national security, things like steel, aluminum, even copper.
But wouldn't that mean higher costs for businesses using those imported materials? What about other countries retaliating?
There's been pushback, even from people within his own party, about the risk of unintended consequences. Like, some experts argue that these tariffs will actually end up raising prices for consumers. And some even worry they could trigger trade wars that could destabilize the whole global economy.
So it's a big gamble. Betting on American manufacturing, but potentially jeopardizing global relations.
It's one way to look at it, yeah. But it's important to remember Lutnick isn't just slapping tariffs on everything. He's also working within complex trade agreements like the USMCA with Canada and Mexico. Actually, he recently gave them temporary exemptions from some tariffs.
Oh, really? That seems kind of contradictory to his America First rhetoric, doesn't it? What's the strategy there?
Well, it shows that his approach is, well, it's complicated. He clearly believes in supporting American industries, but he's also a seasoned businessman. He knows how important global markets are and the need for strategic partnerships. I mean, look at his career. He built Cantor Fitzgerald into a global financial powerhouse.
That's right. He wasn't always in government. Let's talk more about that finance background. I know he started at Cantor Fitzgerald straight out of college, but how did he climb the ranks so fast?
He was a real pioneer there. In the early 90s, he was a driving force behind developing this platform called a SPEED. It totally revolutionized bond trading. It was a huge change for the industry, and it solidified his reputation as someone with vision.
Wow, so he was on the cutting edge of financial tech. That's pretty impressive.
It really is. And it shows he's not afraid of change. He embraces it. But his leadership was really put to the test on September 11th, 2001. Cantor Fitzgerald's offices were in the World Trade Center. Their losses were, well, unimaginable.
It's hard to even think about. The scale of that tragedy is just...
Yeah, it's hard to fathom. And for Lutnick, it wasn't just about losing his brother and colleagues. He also had to rebuild the company, support the victims' families. It was a defining moment, personally and professionally.
And he was so close to being a victim himself, right?
Yeah, he only survived because he was taking his son to kindergarten that morning. It's a stark reminder of how fragile life is, and how one small choice can change everything.
It really is.
Yeah.
It makes me think about how he dealt with that period, the choices he made that led him to the Secretary of Commerce position. It's a fascinating story. Lutnick's story is not your average career path. But before we go too deep into the whole Trump connection, I do want to circle back to the impact of these protectionist policies. They paint a pretty complicated picture of how this is all playing out for businesses.
Yeah, it's definitely not a simple situation. It's not like every business is going to be affected the same way, Some industries might actually benefit from having less competition and more focus on domestic production. But for others, these tariffs could mean way higher costs and even disruptions to their supply chains.
Right. If you're a steel manufacturer in Pennsylvania, these tariffs could be a really good thing. But what if you're a small business owner who relies on imported parts? You could be getting hit from both sides. Higher prices for the materials you need and maybe even less demand if prices for consumers go up too.
Exactly. And then there's the whole question of innovation. If American companies start relying too much on domestic suppliers, are they going to miss out on opportunities to work with international partners or miss out on new technologies being developed overseas?
That's a great point. It's almost like we're trying to rewind to a time before globalization. But the world's a very different place now. Innovation thrives on collaboration, on sharing ideas across borders.
Absolutely. And let's not forget about the financial markets. We've already seen some ups and downs, and some analysts are saying that's partly because of uncertainty around these trade policies. So the Dow Jones, or Dow Jones Industrial Average, it's this stock market index that tracks 30 big U.S. companies. It's often seen as a barometer for how the overall U.S. economy is doing. When investors feel good about the future, the Dow tends to go up. But when there's uncertainty, like we're seeing now with these shifting trade policies, well, the Dow can react pretty negatively.
So these tariffs aren't just impacting businesses directly, they're also creating ripple effects in the stock market, which can affect everyone's investments.
That's right. It's all connected, It's a really complex system, and it's hard to predict all the long-term consequences.
It sounds like businesses are facing a lot of uncertainty right now. What are some things they can do to navigate this? What are some practical steps they can take?
Well, the first thing is to stay informed. Keep an eye on what the Department of Commerce is doing, talk to your industry groups, and make sure you understand how these specific tariffs might affect your supply chain. Being proactive is key. Another important step is to diversify your supply chain. Look into different sourcing options, both here in the U.S. and internationally. Don't put all your eggs in one basket, so to speak.
That makes sense. If you're too reliant on just one supplier, one country, you're more vulnerable if something goes wrong.
Exactly. And this might seem counterintuitive with all this America First talk, but think about exploring opportunities to collaborate with international partners. Innovation often comes from bringing different perspectives and expertise together.
So even with this push to prioritize American businesses, there's still room for strategic partnerships with companies overseas.
Absolutely. Lutnick himself built his career on global finance. He understands the power of international markets.
Okay, so we've got staying informed, diversifying supply chains, and looking into international collaboration. You mentioned earlier that the Dow Jones has been a bit shaky because of all this uncertainty around trade policy. Do you think these protectionist policies will ultimately help or hurt the U.S. economy in the long run?
That's the big question, isn't it? Economists have been debating this for a long time, and there are strong arguments on both sides.
Well, let's hear them. Break it down for us. Potential benefits versus potential drawbacks.
Okay, so let's start with the potential benefits. People who support protectionist policies say that they can help revitalize American industries by shielding them from foreign competition, and that in turn can lead to more jobs, higher wages, and overall economic growth. They also argue that relying less on foreign suppliers can strengthen national security and make the U.S. more self-sufficient in key industries.
So it's about bringing manufacturing back to America, creating jobs, boosting the economy. It definitely has a certain patriotic appeal.
It does. But now let's look at the other side, the potential drawbacks. Critics of protectionism argue that it actually hurts consumers because it leads to higher prices for goods. They also say it stifles innovation because it reduces competition and limits access to global markets. And maybe most importantly, they warn that it can lead to other countries retaliating with their own tariffs. That could trigger trade wars, and those could really destabilize the global economy.
So it's a bit of a gamble then. There's the potential for growth and jobs, but also the risk of higher prices, less innovation, and even international conflict.
Exactly. And like with any complex policy, there are winners and losers. The challenge for policymakers is to weigh these different interests and try to find a balance that benefits the entire country.
It doesn't sound like there's an easy answer. But I'm curious to hear more about how this is affecting specific industries. The sources you sent mentioned steel, aluminum, and copper as being particularly targeted by these tariffs. What does that mean for those sectors?
Okay, well, let's start with steel. The U.S. steel industry has been struggling for decades now, facing competition from cheaper imports, especially from China. These tariffs are supposed to even the playing field and give American steelmakers a fighting chance.
So it's about protecting American jobs, revitalizing an industry that's been struggling. But what about the companies that use steel to make their products? Won't they end up paying more?
Yeah, that's the trade-off. And it's a real concern for industries like construction, manufacturing, even energy, all of which rely heavily on steel. The hope is that the long-term benefits of a stronger domestic steel industry will outweigh those short-term costs.
It sounds like a very delicate balancing act. What about aluminum? How's that industry being affected?
Aluminum is facing similar problems as steel. Cheaper imports have been putting a lot of pressure on American producers, so the goal of these tariffs is to boost domestic production and create more jobs.
But didn't Lutnick give Canada a temporary exemption from those aluminum tariffs?
He did, and that shows just how complicated it is to manage trade relationships, especially with important allies like Canada. And then you have the USMCA, the trade agreement between the US, Canada, and Mexico, which adds another layer of complexity. The goal there is to encourage free trade within North America while also dealing with concerns about unfair competition from other countries.
So it's like a constant juggling act, trying to protect American industries while also maintaining good relationships with their trading partners. Okay, so we've talked about steel and aluminum. What about copper? That one seems a little less obvious, like why target copper with tariffs?
Copper is a bit of a wild card in all of this. It's not as politically charged as steel or aluminum, but it's really important for a lot of industries. Construction, manufacturing, electronics, even renewable energy.
So putting tariffs on copper could have a much wider impact than people might realize.
It could, yeah. And that's why some people are skeptical about Lutnick's decision to include copper in these tariffs. They say it's an unnecessary move that will just end up hurting American businesses and consumers.
I'm starting to see why you said there's no easy answer to whether these protectionist policies are good or bad for the U.S. economy. There are a lot of moving pieces to consider. But one thing's for sure, this is a topic we're going to be hearing about for a long time to come.
You're absolutely right. And as Lutnick continues to roll out his trade agenda, I think we can expect even more twists and turns, more debates, and more attempts to find that balance between protecting American interests and navigating the complexities of the global economy.
It sounds like this is just the beginning of a long and complicated journey. And speaking of journeys, we haven't even gotten into Lutnick's relationship with President Trump and how that might be shaping his policy decisions. That's a fascinating dynamic that deserves a closer look. We've talked about his background, his policies, the potential impact on businesses, but there's one big piece we haven't really explored yet, his connection to President Trump.
Yeah, that's right. They go way back. And it's pretty clear that Lutnick was instrumental in Trump's rise to power. Some people even think that this close relationship might be influencing Lutnick's policy decisions, especially this whole America First agenda.
It makes you wonder if they share some deeper ideological connection, or if it's more about political strategy and personal loyalty.
It's tough to say for sure, but it is interesting that Lutnick's protectionist views aren't that different from some of Trump's core economic beliefs. They both seem skeptical of globalization and both want to see manufacturing jobs return to America.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It's like they both see trade through the same lens, one that puts national interests above global cooperation.
Exactly. And that perspective has definitely shaped Lutnick's approach to trade policy. The aggressive use of tariffs, the renegotiation of trade agreements, it all flows from that worldview.
Okay, so there's a strong connection between Lutnick and Trump, and their shared views might be influencing policy decisions. But what does all this mean for us? How should we be thinking about this new era of trade?
That's the big question, isn't it? I think the most important takeaway is that trade policy isn't this predictable, stable thing anymore. We're in uncharted territory, the old rules are being rewritten, and new alliances are forming. But it's not all bad news. There are definitely opportunities emerging too.
Like what?
Well, for one thing, this gives American businesses a chance to really think about their supply chains and maybe look for new sources. This focus on domestic production could be a great opportunity for smaller, local businesses to step up and fill the gaps.
That's a good point. It's almost like hitting the reset button on manufacturing, a chance to rethink old approaches and embrace new possibilities.
Exactly. And on a global level, this shift in U.S. trade policy could open doors for other countries to step up and become more influential on the world stage.
So it's not just about America, it's about a shifting balance of power globally.
That's exactly right. And that's why it's so important to stay informed, to really understand the nuances of these policy changes, and to think about how they might impact different industries and regions.
But what can businesses do to prepare, besides staying informed? What practical steps can they take?
We talked about some of them earlier. Diversifying supply chains, looking for international collaborations, getting involved. But I think the most important thing is to be adaptable, to be willing to innovate.
So don't get stuck in old ways of thinking. Be ready to pivot and try new things.
Exactly. The businesses that will really thrive in this environment are the ones that can anticipate change, adapt quickly, and seize new opportunities. And that's what I want to leave you with today. As you navigate this new landscape, remember that you have the power to shape your own future. Stay informed, be proactive, and embrace that spirit of innovation.
That's a great note to end on. This has been a really fascinating look at Howard Lutnick, someone who represents both the challenges and the opportunities of this new era of trade. Thanks for joining us.
For more insights like these, don't forget to subscribe to Logistics Pulse on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.